You are now tuned into People City Propaganda. I'm your host, Jason Reedy, organizer with People City Council. I am joined today in my co-hosting duties by Mr. Albert Corrado. Albert, how you doing over there?
I'm doing okay, man. I'm really happy to see you, and I'm really excited for today's episode. I think it's we've had a lot of amazing guests on the show, and today we're starting off the new year with a absolute banger of a guest. So I'm really stoked to jump in here real quick.
Why don't you go ahead and let the people know who we have joining us on the pod today?
So I want to just say I got into back into reading this in 2024. My attention span, as most people's, is pretty bad these days because of social media. But I was like, you know what? I want to read some books. I really want to get back into that. I used to read a lot in high school and afterwards. And I think, Jason, you actually posted about this book called Tip of the Spear. And I was like, oh, that sounds so cool. I've been wanting to read more nonfiction and about stuff that, I think about all the time, whether it's, abolition based or whatever. So I picked that up, and I got to say, it was my book of the year. So of 2024, the best book I read all year. I have bought it as like birthday presents for friends and recommended it to so many people. I met someone the other night here. I'm in Las Vegas for a wedding, and randomly we were talking, and she seemed pretty with it. So I was like, hey, read this book. Like, it's amazing. So today we are joined by Dr. Orisanmi Burton, who is an assistant professor of social anthropology and the author of Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. How are you today, Orisanmi? Thank you for joining us.
Peace. I'm great. I'm honored to be here. Really excited. Yeah, thanks for adding the subtitle. There's a couple other books called Tip of the Spear. One of them is written by like a Marine, and it's about like, Marine stuff. So yeah, this isn't that. So yeah.
We appreciate you coming on the pod, brother. I mean, before we dive into Tip of the Spear, a book that was 9 years in the making, I was wondering if you could tell us what drew you so deep into Black resistance behind prison walls.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways one could tell that story. I'm moved right now to say that I was listening to you talk about how, you're not super into reading, and that was me for a lot of my life. And I have a vivid memory of maybe not the first book I ever read cover to cover without being told to, but at least one of the, either the first or the second. And that was Assata Shakur's autobiography, which was on my parents' bookshelf, which tells you a little bit about like how I was raised, that book was on my bookshelf, but it was just sitting there waiting for me. And for some reason, one summer in high school, or maybe junior high, I can't remember, I just plucked it off the shelf and read it. And it was just like I got hit by a train or something. Like, it was just so clear and vivid and spoke to so many of the things that I wasn't able to articulate with the level of fearlessness, clarity, but also beauty that kind of helped me understand why I didn't like to read, because so much of the shit that I was being told to read didn't do that. And I could tell instinctively that it wasn't getting at the level of truth that I needed to be inspired. And so, of course, for much of that book, Assata Shakur is in prison. And it's very clear that she's in prison because of her radical politics and because of the dangerousness of her ideas and her courage and willingness to actually do what is necessary to take her political conclusions to the people and to do what's necessary to actually transform those conditions. And so that was kind of my introduction to the prison as a zone of revolutionary political thought. And then it wasn't until much later when I started to do my dissertation research and dissertate that I kind of returned to all of that. But I started with Assata Shakur's autobiography because I think the seeds were planted in me fairly early on in terms of me being raised by parents who were in the movement and connected to a lot of the history that's talked about in the book and all of that. But I think that's really the origin. And then as my dissertation research progressed, essentially, and this is how I start the book, I was given an assignment by one of the key figures who's in the book, who said, look, you could do this research and write an academic book on the prisons or whatever, like most of these people do, using these pre-existing academic frameworks that mostly really aren't helpful, he said. If you really want to do something transformative, you need to show that the questions you're asking have already been answered through knowledge produced by militants who were engaged in struggle in a very high level. And that what we need is someone with who's located in academia and who has those skills and that discipline and those politics to demonstrate that intellectual work is actually more rigorous than the vast majority of academic scholarship that emerges. And I sort of accepted that as an assignment, and that was the genesis of the book.
Can I ask, did you receive any sort of like pushback when you sort of were telling people this is what my book is going to be about? Because I feel like, as someone who didn't go to college, I look at academia as like a very white, very sort of liberal world, and I mean liberal in the worst sense you can. Did you get a lot of pushback, or did you have people telling you like, why are you doing this? Like, what's the point?
A couple of things. The first thing is that, if I'm being honest, I didn't fully understand what the book was about until maybe like 3 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So like, you started off by saying that the book was 9 years in the making. That's actually a mistake. It's not your mistake, it's mine. I've been saying that. But then I looked back at that first interview with Eddie, and it was in 2013. The book came out in 2023. So it was 10 years in the making. It wasn't until like year 7 when I really started to understand what the book is about, that the book is about war. And so if I had started saying that immediately, I'm sure people would have been like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, you can't do that, whatever. But, I sort of started out at the edges of this thing, but kept digging for more information, doing more research until I landed on what I understood to be the crux of the argument. And that wasn't until late in the game. But also, I have a PhD, but I went to UNC Chapel Hill, which isn't like a super elite place. Most of the people who were supervising me as a grad student didn't really understand what I was doing. They supported me, but they didn't really get it. Like, it wasn't really their field. And to their credit, they just sort of let me do what I needed to do. And that's sort of precisely what I needed. I felt like I had the ability to get the kind of intellectual mentorship that I needed on my own. So I didn't have a whole lot of people all up in my business, which was great. And then once I started to really get serious over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, there's several arguments in the book about political violence and things that typically aren't analyzed in that way in academic text. And so as I was writing the book, there were several moments where I was like, I don't think I'm supposed to say this, or I don't think I'm supposed to say this. But there was never anyone saying that. It was a kind of like internalized thing in my head that I had sort of experienced through osmosis by virtue of being, I think, in the academy or living in liberal society, where there are certain, sort of self-evident boundaries that one isn't supposed to transgress. And so I just made a decision early on to say, look, I'm just going to tell the truth as I see it. I'm going to try to be as I'm going to try to be as truthful as I can in terms of what the material that I have found says and what the arguments that were being made were, even if those arguments scare me, even if those arguments exceed what I am comfortable with in terms of my own willingness to engage in risky political behavior, even if that means that what I produce won't be legible to academics and may not result in me acquiring, sort of like financial or immaterial benefits from the academy, right? This is how these things work. So I just said to myself, look, I was given an assignment by people who actually did these things, who actually risked their lives and were killed and tortured because of them. And my assignment is simply to tell the truth about it. And so that's what I did. And so I sort of just pushed all those other concerns as far away from my mind as possible as I was writing. And now that it's out, it just so happens that, I knew that movement people would dig the book because that's who it was for, but it turns out that like academics seem to like it too. I'm certain lots of them don't. I know lots of them don't. I know that, and I hope it keeps them up at night, honestly. But I haven't heard from them.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate on archival war, the methodological approach you developed for writing Tip of the Spear. First, what does it entail, and why is it so crucial for how we engage with Black liberation?
Sure. I mean, so the crux of the argument of the book is that it's not something that's going to be a surprise to people who are engaged in radical political activity, but it's not something that's been sort of explored through a scholarly lens with any kind of rigor. And that is that something that lots of people have said previously, that politics is war by other means, or as Huey said, politics is war without bloodshed. Mao said it, Karl von Clausewitz said it, Foucault said it. Lots of people have said this, but then what would that mean to really take that seriously and thread it through the analysis of empirical evidence? Because most of the time what happens is, what we end up getting is kind of like liberal modes of analysis, which are ultimately premised on the idea that the system we inhabit can be reformed. And I don't believe that. And I think most academic scholarship, that's the implicit basis of it. Even the scholarship that claims to be radical or abolitionist or revolutionary, it makes those claims through a liberal framework, which in some ways invalidates the arguments and some of the source material that gets drawn on. So the book is about war, it's about prisons as a domain of war. But then I also had to wonder why no one had written a book like the one I wrote. And part of why that is because the material war that I'm talking about is only one domain of a multifaceted war, which includes a psychological war, a war that involves the intentional efforts to obscure what has happened in the past, right? And so, there's lots of historians and others who write about the silences in the archives, but sometimes those silences, the degree of intentionality in misrepresenting and obscuring the unfolding of history is, I think, underemphasized. And so I'm thinking about, no, these are people who are actually trying to hide stuff and distort stuff and trying to shape public perception in really intentional ways. And so the struggle to understand radical history in ways that don't pathologize the people who are the motive force of that history, that itself is a domain of war. And so then one has to approach the archive with that in mind. And so what it means lots of things. It means, one, we have to recognize that state actors lie. They don't always tell the truth. I mean, this is so obvious sometimes when you say it out loud, but it's like, there's an unspoken assumption in a lot of academic scholarship that, state records are the most valid kinds of records. And I just categorically reject that idea, because state actors lie. Intelligence agents are in all areas of our society, and they're trained to lie. That's what they do. That is their job. Okay. So that's one thing. Okay. The other thing is that even when a lot of these folks think they're telling the truth, they're telling the truth that is refracted through racist, patriarchal, liberal fascist epistemologies, so that even their truth is a distortion from the perspective that I'm trying to advance, right? And so what does this mean? It means that state records and state sources can never be allowed to speak for themselves. They can never have the last word. Their truth value it always has to be under suspicion. And they always have to be put in productive tension with the discourses and ideologies of revolutionaries who are contesting those ideas. And that truth, to the extent that a study can get at such a thing, is the result of the confrontation and the struggle of these ideas.
Shay. Another question around archives, since you do so much work around them, is where should Black freedom struggle archives live? We know that in a lot of PWIs, we see these collections, whether it be from Huey P. Newton or Kathleen Cleaver, and you can go on down the line where they've acquired these archives over time, but they aren't accessible. A lot of it hasn't been digitized. You can only get a certain amount of it if you request it. So where do you think they should live?
So the question of where should they live, I don't even think, first of all, I don't think we know where they do live. I'm not sure that they live in those places. I mean, they're there, but there are other places as well. Like some of the best shit I found was in people's houses. And the reason why I found that was because I built actual relationships with people and over a long-term period of time, during which I demonstrated my seriousness, my trustworthiness. I demonstrated my politics in the sense that they knew that I wasn't gonna, produce some BS with their stuff that made them look stupid, which is what most of these texts do. They make radicals look immature, stupid. They don't put their decisions in context. They don't talk about what they did in a way that could be of value to future generations, including the mistakes that they made, right?
Yeah.
So I think that they live in lots of places. Some of the stuff I used that no one has cited before, to my knowledge, some of the shit's just on the internet. Do you know what I mean? Like, it wasn't hidden. So some of the stuff I found was hidden, but some of the shit's just on the internet, bro. It's just like Google, you know what I mean? But I think so part of the point that I'm making is that finding the stuff is probably the easier part. The hardest part is the interpretive labor of making the connections between, because so militant archives are scattered all over the place. They're not all collected in one place, and they're not collected archivally. They're not collected under the logics that are aligned with how the people who produced them thought about these things. This is also a feature of archival war. It's like these collections are acquired through various means, and then they're archived, and then they're described by people who aren't necessarily aligned with those politics. And so you got to do a lot of reading between the lines and inference. And so I think that's actually the harder part than finding them. But your point still is a valid one, which is, movements don't have control over their historical memory. And I just think that is a feature of where those movements are in terms of their power relationships vis-a-vis the state, right? I could say more about that, but I don't know. I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know you talk about in your book and in some of your other writings how our revolutionaries are walking archives in themselves. They can't always speak on or write down what really happened in certain situations because of the threat to their own freedom and the greater movement.
Oh, doubt. And there's a African proverb: when the elder dies, a library is burned.
In Tip of the Spear, counterinsurgency is a central theme throughout the book. Could you discuss how counterinsurgency became one of the most insidious and defining strategies used by the carceral warfare state?
In order to understand counterinsurgency, we have to understand insurgency. Counterinsurgency is a response to insurgency. Insurgency is the state's term for revolutionary warfare. The U.S. counterinsurgency state begins to use the term insurgency instead of revolutionary warfare in order to delegitimize revolutionary warfare. Because if you call something revolutionary warfare, it encourages people to think about revolution, to think about, okay, well, what might the cause be? Why do these people want a revolution? You know, I mean, the United States engaged in a revolutionary war, and that's something that is lionized, right? And so counterinsurgency already, in the way that that term is mobilized, is a delegitimizing gesture to try to delegitimize revolutionary war. After World War II and the emergence of the Cold War, revolutionary war becomes the primary form of war that erupts in the world. So it's no longer sort of great power war in which two states are fighting one another. It becomes smaller wars, or what they call irregular wars or asymmetrical wars. They got all these terms for the same thing, which is basically a people within the territorial boundaries of a particular state rising up to try to free themselves from the yoke of colonialism. So revolutionary war is anti-colonial war. And those started to prop up all over the place after World War II, you know, and many of them were successful, right? We can talk about China, we can talk about Cuba, we can talk about Algeria. And Black people in the United States were profoundly inspired by this and started to understand themselves as part of this movement that came to be understood as the Third World. And they started to rethink the sort of discourse and strategy of civil rights, which was about fighting for more rights and better treatment within the American project, and started to think instead about anti-colonialism, which was about self-determination and autonomy. And there were different kinds of projects that emerged under this rubric, but this is the idea. And so colonial powers had to develop new strategies to manage this particular kind of war. Because, you know, and for folks who want to get into this, the place to start is with Mao's writings on on guerrilla warfare. This is where the state starts, right? So there's a thing called the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. It's the product of several generations of state colonial counterinsurgent knowledge, primarily authored by, what's his name? David Petraeus. But he's really drawing on French and British counterinsurgency thinkers who've been fighting in the colonial wars for a really long time. And Petraeus starts the Counterinsurgency Field Manual with Mao and is explicit in the fact that the Counterinsurgency Field Manual is in some ways a response to Mao's strategy of revolutionary warfare. So in order to understand counterinsurgency, we really have to understand revolutionary warfare, because it's a response to revolutionary warfare. And this is really important, because I think there's a lot of interest in the term counterinsurgency. And I think that without that framing being front and center, people run the risk of reifying counterinsurgency and making it into a more sophisticated body of knowledge than it is, when in fact it's a reactionary set of strategies that are designed to that are a response to our movements. If we were to distill down Mao's theory of people's war or revolutionary warfare or guerrilla warfare down to its basic premise, it's the idea that the disciplined, militant, dedicated revolutionaries have to always be connected to, accountable to, embedded within, and respected by the masses of the people who are not going to be most of the time willing and able to engage in struggle at a level that matches that of the sort of disciplined revolutionary cadre, right? So it's really about how to build connection and unity among people engage who have a common national interest. So counterinsurgency is the inverse of that. If we were to distill it down, really, essentially, we arrive at a very old, going all the way back to the Roman Empire strategy of divide and rule. How do we divide the insurgent population? How do we ensure that their antagonisms are against one another instead of allowing them to unify and directing their antagonisms against us? And the way they do that is through a whole bunch of different kinds of dirty tricks that are ultimately aimed at keeping movements fractured and encouraging people to think about themselves as having different interests, any interest other than a national interest of self-determination, encouraging them to think that their interests are most likely to be met by the dominant authority rather than by this movement that's seeking self-determination. So I'm sorry, that was a long answer. The question was, how did it get embedded? I think that's a theoretical question. I think that my argument is that so much of the world we live in is in fact oriented towards counter-revolution. I mean, I think that like counter-revolution is one of the driving forces of economic and political development, preventing people from rising up is like embedded into the kind of DNA of our political order.
So I want to acknowledge, as you've mentioned in previous interviews, that you don't consider yourself a revolutionary. However, in my opinion, the formulation of Tip of the Spear was a revolutionary act. I'm in deep gratitude to you for putting this project together, and I want to recognize how it will continually serve revolutionaries like myself for years to come. Tip of the Spear is a reminder of our resistance and underscores that the Attica Rebellion didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a protracted struggle, one that I hadn't connected as well as many others. And so that leads into Albert's question. I'll let him take it away.
Yeah. So I want to know, I've heard of Attica my whole life as a point of reference. I was watching Dog Day Afternoon. Have you seen that movie for something?
Of course.
There is this scene where he sort of, incites Attica. He says, Attica, Attica. And so like, as a person who was getting into movies and seeing that at 15, I was like, oh, what is that? And read about it. I think what you've put here is a incredible sort of timeline and how it affected so many things beyond that. But why do you think it's played such a big role in the public consciousness that Attica is, like, you say Attica to people and they kind of know what you mean? They have an assumption, they read something, they heard something. So why do you think that's the case?
Man, I like this question. Well, one of the things I say in the book is that Attica is a story we only think we know. So the first question is like, what do we think we know about Attica? Like the guy in Dog Day Afternoon, I forget his name. What did he mean when he was yelling Attica, Attica? I think he meant the cops are pigs, they'll kill you and then lie about it. Right? Yeah. Would you agree with that?
I think in the context of the movie, he felt like, I think if I remember correctly, the movie is about him it's a bank robbery gone wrong. They're holding hostages. And so I think there's a moment in the movie where they're trying to negotiate some sort of peace or surrender. And he knows that if I do this, if I give in to the state, they will kill me in front of all these people and nothing will be done about it. So I think that's the context in which the movie uses it, which, is sort of the, Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think Pacino ad-libbed that. That was not in the script. He ad-libbed that, which I think speaks again to what you're saying about the extent to which it's in the public consciousness. Okay. Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York at the time and who orchestrated that, I spend some time in the book talking about how he's a psychological warfare expert who is adjacent to put it carefully, the CIA, and at a very high level. I mean, like he was mentored by Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA in the 50s. And my argument about the Attica massacre, see, because when there's two sides to Attica, war is a dialectic, it's an antagonism. There's two sides to war. When people talk about Attica, usually they're talking about the massacre. That's what Pacino was talking about in Dog Day Afternoon. He was talking about state violence, the capacity of the state to enact world-shattering violence on populations. This is what Rockefeller actually wanted to communicate. It was a public massacre. They let cameras in there. They recorded it. They showed the bodies of naked and tortured prisoners publicly. They wanted everyone to see that and internalize the message. Why? Because they hoped that it would serve as a salutary effect on future movements. This is a direct quote from Richard Nixon, who opined that, okay, good, I'm glad this happened because now everyone will see, right? So part of what we think we know about Attica is what the state wanted us to know about Attica, which is that they'll kill you and torture you if you rebel. And so don't rebel. I mean, that's the message they were trying to convey. It doesn't actually work because a year after Attica, there were more prison rebellions than in any year in US history up to that point. So it failed. But that's the message. What don't we know about Attica? Up until the book, most people didn't know about the revolutionary and anti-colonial history of Attica. Most people who haven't read my book, but who have heard of Attica, will assume that Attica was primarily about how oppressed prisoners are and how bad they wanted to improve their immediate conditions, which of course was part of what they were demanding. But I think that narrative is actually an outgrowth of what we were talking about earlier, which is archival war and psychological warfare, and about how the stories we are encouraged to tell about our own radical history actually truncate that history in really violent ways and prevent us from seriously engaging with revolutionary thought. So that would sort of be my answer. I think the popular narrative of Attica is a result of this kind of psychological warfare process. I think just at a basic level, I think it's pathological that when most people think about Attica, they think about the repression and just don't know about the extent and dynamism and complexity of the rebellion, which was understood to be a profound threat at the highest levels of government. I mean, at the highest levels of government, right? This was a prison rebellion of 1,200 people in a remote town in Western New York. And as a result of it, the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, the Army, the Navy, like they were all circulating memos about this shit. So we don't know that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think one thing you really kind of spell out in the book is just the sort of nature of the way that like the people in power freaked the fuck out when this was happening. They were, I think there was just this really sort of intense reaction to it because it was something that they knew. I think they kind of even then could tell that this was going to be something that people talked about. And I think when Pacino did that thing in the movie, like it had just happened, I'm pretty sure. So it was like, right, it was like probably within the same year or something. So for that to be that sort of prevalent and known was, this is a time before the internet or whatever. So it's just like people were hearing about it and everyone was kind of, trying to figure out how to prevent that from happening again. I do want to talk about another question that I have is that, reading the book, there's this tension, between captives, right? So you kind of talk about the dudes who were kind of on their way out. Maybe they had a few months left in their sentence and they weren't really trying to get caught up in that. And maybe they sympathized, maybe they wanted to be, but they really couldn't be because, hey, I'm going to be free soon and I don't want to be here. And then the people who were serving longer sentences who were like, okay, we have to do this. And I guess it's the imperfect nature of the rebellion, right? It's like this tension that exists within people, within movements. There's interpersonal stuff. There's disagreement on tactics. So I want to just kind of, if you can expand on that and, were any lessons learned from that sort of tension? And is that a tension that also existed in other rebellions? And do we see any sort of fallout from that stuff, in the current day?
No, this is another great question. So here's something that's interesting. I mean, part of what happens is that in the lead up to the Long Attica Revolt, as I call it, the state is using the prison more intensely as a form of political repression. So they're just locking up militants and potential militants, poor people, people who are homeless, people who are addicted to drugs. They're just locking them all up, right? As a way to get them off the street and maintain order in the streets. But of course, the book is about how this strategy backfired and how by concentrating all of these people in jails, they created the conditions for a new kind of rebellion behind prison walls. So a new zone of revolutionary warfare, a new zone of insurgency opens up. Part of why this new zone of insurgency or revolutionary warfare or rebellion opens up is because of the compressed nature of prisons and jails, in how it in some ways flattens the class differences and the political differences of the people who are behind the walls, such that suddenly everyone is feeling a very intense, unmediated level of repression, which causes them to understand that their differences aren't super significant, right? And so this is sort of part of the context that is propelling these rebellions, is the intense degree of repression. So, but even within that repression, I try to show all of these different differences, right? And all of the different contradictions within these movements. You mentioned people who have different sentence lengths. There's members of rival gangs in there. There's people who belong to different organizations. There's racial discontent. There's language barriers. There's people who have a coherent political ideology and people who are non-political. There are people with different kinds of addictions. All of that is there, okay? But it's sort of flattened in the prison context. But these rebellions are these moments of like delimited freedom and autonomy, where then people are forced once again to deal with this. And so part of what happens is that not just the people who have organizing experience, but also people who are in the military are there. They have this sort of experience with military discipline. People who were in gangs were there. Those gangs were like paramilitary street formations in the 60s. So they had understanding of organizational discipline. And then you have people who were creating new kinds of organizations specifically for the prison context to try to figure out how to bring people together, right? So this is sort of what's going on. But the question about the enduring legacy of this kind of difference is really important, Because when people talk about, so when Pacino yells Attica, Attica, he's talking about the Attica massacre, which is this kind of discrete moment of intense violence. But part of what the book does in chapter 5 is it looks at these other sort of seductive counterinsurgency techniques that are implemented and institutionalized in the wake of the massacre. And essentially, again, I said, look, if we were to distill down counterinsurgency, it would be divide and conquer. Essentially, what these reformist, I call them techniques of reformist counterinsurgency. Essentially, what they're doing is they're trying to create and reify a class structure within the prisons. They're trying to fracture what had grown into a coherent collective movement. They're trying to fracture it into different parts and give different enclaves within the prison different things to aspire to in different directions so that folks don't unify, right? So they start more intentionally mixing people with different sentence lengths into certain prisons. Because they learned that if you put a whole bunch of lifers in one prison like they did in Attica, then you have a whole critical mass of people who have the same temporal outlook in terms of what their future prospect is. But if you mix it up with people that get out in 2 years, people who get out in 20 years, it's much harder to form a critical mass. And so part of what counterinsurgency is about analyzing actually existing contradictions and tensions within liberation movements and trying to exacerbate those tensions, trying to make them worse. And we see that everywhere. And so one of the arguments of the book is that the prison is really just a paradigm for how power works. So all of the techniques that I outline in terms of what's happening in prisons, those techniques are very similar to what's happening outside of prisons. It just so happens that it's harder to see them unfolding outside of prisons because the world is more diffuse. So it's harder to see what's going on.
But I wanted to, my last sort of part of what I wanted to talk about was the fact that, like, there is a part that stuck out to me where one of the captives is talking to another captive and they're outside. And he says, you know, why are you crying? He says, oh, I haven't seen the stars in, you know, whatever, 20 something years. And, you know, that's something that has that on top of, you know, 10 other things. It's a thing that I go back to when I think about the book. And when I was, you know, researching, you know, about to have you on the show, is just like, it really kind of paints the picture of what exactly these people go through and why they would be driven to do something like, you know, put themselves in this grave danger. So I guess, could you just maybe just talk about that and in your conversations with people who were there or who knew people there, what that meant and yeah, those moments of, you know, humanity and remembering that you are not just a captive person, you are a being of light and belong to the universe, you know?
Hell yeah. No, thank you. I mean, part of what, you know, I'm talking about war, I'm talking about prison and violence, assassination. It's a book all about men and Black men in particular. And so it was really important for me to highlight something that I learned through this process, which is the extent to which war and, you know, the use of violence as a form of self-defense is really just the outer layer of the struggle. And that beneath those things is, I think I say in the book, beneath these things is something much more sacred. And ultimately, you know, it's like Che Guevara said in terms of, you know, like revolutionaries are guided by feelings of love. Like, I learned that over and over again while working on this book. It's like, and this again is why archival war is so important, because, you know, the state really doesn't understand these movements. They really don't. They only see, this is what I mean, even when they think they're telling the truth, they only see these movements through their way of seeing the world. The people who are organizing and administering this war really see the world as war. That's how they see the world, as a kind of a Manichaean struggle of good and evil. They're good and their enemies are evil, and like that's how it is. And that way of thinking manifests itself in lots of different arenas, including in their personal lives. But that's that, right? Okay. The militants, the Black militant revolutionaries that I'm talking about, have an analysis of war, but they don't see the world as war. War is not their epistemology. They're inhabiting war because their enemies are seeing them in terms of war. But they don't see the world that way. And so I wanted to try to show that by showing all of these moments of intimacy, all of these moments of a desire for building stronger collectives, all of these attempts to like convene with the natural environment, all of these moments where they had opportunities to carry out the kinds of violence that they had endured, to reciprocate those kinds of violence against their enemies. And instead of just automatically and reflexively killing their enemies, which we know is what their enemies would do to them because that's what they eventually did, instead of doing that, they had a conversation about it. They had a debate about it. They said, okay, well, let's talk about this. They said, okay, yeah, well, we could kill them. We've got good reason to do that. They did this, this, and this. But we could also not kill them. What are the reasons for that? And they had a debate. They didn't all agree on it, but they reached a collective decision most of the time. And collectively, they abided by their decision because they were more interested in the collective. And this, I think, is a reflection of the kinds of ethics that are embedded in the movement. And so I wanted to show that. I wanted to show that. And I wanted to show the complex forms of intimacy and love and care that they were enacting through the struggle. And this beautiful idea of like tuning with the stars and all of that is part of it. And I'm glad that stuck with you, because like that to me is the actual substance of their politics. It's not about, they're not trying to take the master's place. They're trying to destroy the master-slave relation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of moments of restraint where you have the, you know, upper hand and you can act as the oppressors do. And then honestly, you know, like they had every right, like you said, they had every right to do that. They had reasons why we could go and do this, and they would not feel bad for a moment, because as we saw when the power took back the power from the captives, there was so much sexual violence. There was so much, you know, obviously like people were killed. And so and I think it's interesting to know that like they made the decision to not act as their oppressors do, even though they knew we're probably not going to hold this position for very long. We know that when we fall, we are going to, violence is going to be visited upon us in many, many ways. And to me, that is, I think, ultimately what separates, you know, revolutionaries and good people that, you know, from the state, is that they have to have these moral quandaries, even though they know that, hey, if we're back in a position of you know, anything less than power, we're going to be harmed. And that to me is a very interesting dynamic that I think plays out really well in the book. So thank you for writing it. It is such a study of so many beautiful things. And you know, some of it was very hard to read. And did you have any sort of moments where you had to kind of reckon with kind of talking about some of this horrific stuff that happened to these captives?
Yeah, chapter 4 is rough. Chapter 4 is a study of sexual violence. The story of Attica, the massacre. So on the one hand, I said earlier, like Rockefeller wanted us to know about the massacre, right? And so that story has been told a lot of times. People know about that, right? They don't know about the extent of the sexual violence. It's interesting. This book on Attica, Blood in the Water, it won a Pulitzer Prize. And it goes into extensive detail about how the brothers were tortured and stripped naked. But the term sexual violence is not used. The sexual nature of that violence is not analyzed. And I didn't particularly want to do that. I mean, it's not something that I wanted to do, but I felt like that's what needed to be done, because there were actually, it was what I tried to show, like I don't know how successful I was. I tried to make it such that chapter is not about necessarily, primarily about the degraded and abused Black subject. Although, obviously, that's a huge part of it. Part of what I tried to make it about is white masculinity, like the pathology of white masculinity, such that this rebellion was essentially viewed as a sexual assault against white masculinity. And then what in response has to happen for that embattled white masculinity to be reconstituted. And that's not, I mean, I don't do I guess I do psychoanalysis, but like, that's not really my jam. I wasn't trying to be up in anybody's head like that, but that's sort of what was required to write that. It was, and as I was writing it, it was tough. I mean, I'm raising children, so just, it was very difficult to do that. And then when I finished that chapter, I tried to just move on to the next one and couldn't, and realized that I needed about 2 months to just decompress, which wasn't evident to me at the time, but afterwards I was like, oh, I think maybe I'm traumatized. I need to put this away for a little while. So that is what I ended up doing. So that was very difficult. Yeah, that was definitely the most difficult part.
I'd love to talk briefly about your 2021 piece, Captivity, Kinship, and Black Masculine Care Work Under Domestic Warfare, which I highly recommend our listeners read. Throughout the piece, you detail the heartwarming exchanges between you and Absolute, an incarcerated Black man with whom you knew through personal and familial networks. You talk about how through your letter writing practice with Absolute, you both began to think of it as a form of community building, grassroots intelligence gathering, collective theorization, and mutual aid. So I was just wondering, and I know initially I think the piece was titled A Language of Liberation, but could you expand on how is letter writing a language of liberation?
How did you know that?
I do my research.
Damn, I didn't even know that was in the mix. It was titled that. I'm so glad it's not anymore. Well, prisons are all about dividing people, like I said, dividing people from the community, dividing prisoners from each other, dividing families, dividing individuals from their authentic selves. I mean, that's what solitary confinement does, or tries to do anyway. Letters are, so on the one hand, and I didn't get into this in the article, but the book talks about how the very possibility of writing letters was the outcome of a struggle. Like, incarcerated people had to struggle for the right to write letters. And there's all these kinds of, like, I don't know, when the last time most people don't write letters anymore, right? So it's like, we don't necessarily remember what it's like to get a letter, even if you're not in prison. getting a handwritten letter is exciting. This idea that like the physical material nature of it, the idea of someone going through the labor of producing this letter and sharing it, and the idea that you're now holding this thing that they produced for you, it creates this kind of emotional connection that it can't be replicated through other mediums of communication. And the emotional impact of that is multiplied immeasurably when someone is in a condition like imprisonment or even war, where they're out somewhere at war, where they're extracted from their original context. And so in that way, it becomes just the mere, even irrespective of what's in the letter, the writing and receiving of letters then becomes a political methodology in a context in which the state is trying to limit and control sociality and human relationships. But then if you multiply that by actually engaging in political discourse through the letter, so there's all of these different interesting ways. Now, it's no accident then that we're in a moment where prison officials are engaged in a process of doing away with written letters coming in and out of prisons. They're giving away, in quotes, free, in quotes, tablets, encouraging people incarcerated to download all these apps and games and movies to distract them from studying. They're only, in many instances, allowed now to write these emails, which are heavily surveilled, through all kinds of keyword technologies, but also data mined for marketing purposes. It's financially extractive in that, they charge extra for attachments, for photo attachments, and there's all these limitations on what you can do, right? So this is, again, part of this counterinsurgency process that's embedded in how history is unfolding right now. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Two last questions and we'll get you out of here. I know you're in the process of putting together the writings of Dhoruba bin Wahad. If I remember a few years back, you framed it as an autobiography. I don't know if that's still the case or if maybe things have changed, but can you give us a little more insight into that project? It's one that I'm very excited for.
Oh man, it's so daunting. It's so daunting. Dhoruba bin Wahad was he's a veteran of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party, one of the kind of key architects of the Black Liberation Army, former political prisoner, philosopher. Yeah, D is the man.
Yes.
We've been working together for a while. I'm going back and forth. The idea of writing a biography at this stage, after I just finished this massive project, it gives me no small amount of anxiety because I understand the level of commitment that it would take to do it right.
Mm-hmm.
And man, I'm just not sure if I have it in me just yet. Especially, and I mean, now see, part of this has to do with how the academy works. If somebody would just give me a fellowship where I don't have to teach, and I could just focus, that's another story. So I've been applying for those. People say they're interested in Black radical politics, but like getting money to do radical shit is a whole nother ball game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, if you're super successful getting a whole bunch of money doing what you think is radical shit, then it's like, is that really radical? So there's that contradiction. But now I don't want to say too much because I'm still in the exploratory phase, but I have some really excellent grad students who have been helping me work on the Daruba project. And I'm experimenting with trying to find a genre that blurs the boundary between autobiography and edited volume.
Okay.
I have a lot of material that is archival in nature about Daruba telling his own story. And I also have a lot of writings that he's done that have not seen the light of day. And I'm playing around with the idea now of trying to combine those things such that it is both an edited volume of his previous writings, but it's also autobiography, and all of it was written by him and it's arranged chronologically. So I'm kind of experimenting with this now, and I'm reaching out to publishers to see who would be interested in that. But I really, again, I need a context in which people will kind of just let me do things the way I want. So, but I've made a lot of, I've since getting those research assistants, things are moving along, man. So I'm working on something else at this moment. But I'm working on that as well. And I hope to have it sent out in 2025. So maybe it'll see the light of day in 2026. That's my plan. I'm glad you're excited about that, though. I am too, man.
Yeah,
it's gonna be great.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a phenomenal project. The last question I had for you, amongst all the things that you do, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading? Oh, I have a good answer to that question.
okay.
Usually the question would be, I'm reading some obscure newspaper from the 60s, or I'm reading some government report that was declassified, blah, blah, blah. So I'm doing that. I am doing that. But I'm finally reading a book that I've been wanting to read forever, which is called The Man Who Cried I Am. And it's by an author named John A. Williams. He wrote the book. It came out in 1967. He was in the milieu with Chester Himes, James Baldwin. He's one of these black authors who was an expat in France, and he was in that context. And the book is widely regarded as one of the best books of that generation, but it's largely forgotten. The book is a lightly fictionalized account of what it was like for these black expat authors in the 60s, going back and forth between Europe and the United States, trying to be writers. But, and this is a spoiler alert, it ends, it's an important spoiler alert, and it won't ruin the book because most of the book is not about this at all, and it kind of comes out of nowhere, but it's important for our conversation for reasons that will become clear in a moment. It ends with Williams. I'm not quite finished. I got a couple more pages to go. It ends with Williams talking about this fiction called the King Alfred Plan, which is this government plan to commit genocide against Black Americans by herding them into concentration camps. Wow. And he calls it the King Alfred Plan. And after he finished the novel, he took excerpts of that part of the plan, of that part of the book, and handed them out to people on the subway in New York. And he also sent them to newspapers, Black newspapers all across the country. And they ended up printing the shit, often thinking that it was real. Like, people thought it was real. Like, it was like a Black ghetto version of the War of the Worlds thing with Orson Welles, right? But people thought it was real because the idea that people were going to herd Black people into concentration camps was like widely understood to be a fact at that time. Mm-hmm. So I'm working on an article about this conspiracy theory And I'm wondering why people who continue to call this idea conspiracy theory don't comment on the fact that that is the moment at which the United States begins its globally and historically unprecedented experiment with locking Black people up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So anyway, that's what I'm reading.
Wonderful. Well, this has been an insightful and powerful conversation. We want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the platform and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. For folks that want to tap in with what you're doing, they can follow you on Twitter and...
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. I don't tweet, but I'm there. I only tweet when I have something going on. I'm what you might call a lurker, but I'm not hard to find. I'm in these streets.
Okay. For those interested in purchasing Tip of the Spear, please do so from Workshops for Gaza, a collective committed to the liberation of Palestine. All proceeds will directly support solidarity efforts in Gaza. Again, want to thank you so much for coming on to do this.
We hope.
Oh man, this was a pleasure.
Oh God. Yeah, we're so happy you. Yeah, you were great. We really appreciate you.
Right on. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Peace.
All right.
Shout out to all our listeners for tuning in. Free them all. Fuck the pigs. And you'll hear from us soon.